I'm talking into a battery-operated cassette tape recorder, and I have been asked by some of the members of the family to record a few things about my life. This is Harry Grambua in Rogers City, Michigan. At the present time, I'm 82 years old. Now, according to my mother, Alma Grambua, I was born at approximately 11:30 p.m. Friday, December 15th, 1911, at 206 West Huron Avenue in Rogers City. It was then the village of Rogers. Later became Rogers City. The houses, of course, at that time were not numbered. And the street names, however, appear on the original plat of the village of Rogers, made up in 1870. So the town was 41 years old when I entered the world. My mother was attended in my birth by Dr. William Arscott, one of the early physicians in the village, and also attended by my grandmother, who was Teresa Hardy Dramberg, who lived in the township of Metz, about 12 miles south of Rogers, which at that time was a village. My parents rented a small apartment from my father's aunt, a Mrs. John Petalcow, and that's where I was born. Now, Mrs. John Petalcow, Wilhelmina, was a Schultz, and she was a stepsister to my grandfather, Herman Grambua. The family came from Germany about 1869, and they homesteaded in Section 12 area of Belknap Township, Presque Isle County, Michigan. Mrs. Petalcow was my godmother, and she also was there at my birth. And it's interesting to note that on her death, and in the approximately 1926, she left $200 in her will to me. I apparently was one of her favorites. And I recall when I was in school, I would occasionally stop in and see, as we called her, Tanta Petalcow. The money that I was given money by my grandparents, Julius and Teresa Dramberg, $5 gold piece, which was given to my dad with the instruction that he was to open a savings account for me at the Presque Isle Bank. And that money was left there. And in 1930, when I went to college at Michigan State, I started to use that money. And my dad, George Grambua, of course, was working at the bank at that time, and he was the man in charge of the bank was a Mr. C.H. Osgood, who lived on 3rd Street, immediately adjacent to what is now the Presbyterian Church. The place where they lived is now the manse for the Presbyterian Church. I might just note that the lots on which the Presbyterian Church were built were donated back in about 1923 to the church for the purpose of building the church. And then later, when Mr. and Mrs. Osgood retired, they sold their own home to the church for a modest sum, and that is still today the manse for the Presbyterian Church in Rogers City. The account was opened on December 16th, the next day. It happened to be a Saturday, but in those days, the bank was open on a Saturday morning. So my savings account started as of that time. My number happened to be number 11. That account was just vacated by somebody previously, and so my dad just used that vacant spot in the account book, and it became mine for a period of almost 80 years. Later on, of course, account number 11 was switched to a very fancy 9-digit account for using computers. I was the second of 6 children of George and Alma Grambua, and older brother Herman had been born on December 5th, 1909. In the following years, his brother George was born in 1918, his sister Grace in 1920, and twin sisters Ernestine and Treese in 1922. In 1912, my parents moved into their new home built on 3rd Street in the village of Rogers, a large home on a lot about 100 by 150. 2 bedrooms and a living room and a dining room and a kitchen on the 1st floor along with a pantry. And there were 3 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. There was a full basement and an outside entrance to the home. Also on the lot was a horse barn, and later became the car garage. The horse barn had a hayloft and regular hay cribs and oat bins, and small horses were actually housed overnight, and over the weekend when relatives came from the family homes area of Metz Township. My mother and dad were born on farms that were next to each other in Metz Township. Before my dad and mother had their first car, a Model T Ford, they often rented a horse and a buggy from the local livery stable and housed the horse overnight in the barn. On certain occasions, my dad would also rent a horse and buggy and keep the horse overnight so that he could go trout fishing on a Sunday morning. Take the horse and buggy and a fishing partner, maybe Henry Klee or Otto Schmekel, and they would go and fish at Trout River or certain branches of Swan River or Silver Creek or the Little or Big Akia. That was the mode of transportation for most people at that time. The family home on 3rd Street in Rogers City was on a lot that was 100 by 150. A corner lot on 3rd and Main Street, and 3rd or Main Street, and on the side street was Woodward Avenue. This area of Rogers City was just outside of the original village plat and was known as Gum's Addition, a 40-acre area that had been planted with fruit trees in an all-open area. There were a variety of pear, plum, apple trees that bore a great crop. And on our particular lot that my folks had, there were 11 apple trees and 3 cherry trees. And the apples were a variety of Welty and a Northern Spy and several types of cherries. Some were sweet cherry trees, and one was what they call a Japanese cherry tree. It wasn't particularly good at eating, but it had a large pit, but it was very, very sweet, and it made excellent wine. And of course, my dad was a winemaker. He used to make cherry wine and dandelion wine and wild grape wine and of course the red grape wine and white wine. And the lot was big, and a large part of the area, we didn't have lawns. There was the yard, in front of the yard, even up to the sidewalk, was planted with potatoes and corn, and carrots and beans and peas, and a patch of strawberries and rhubarb, and beets, and then of course a flower garden. My mother was a great flower garden person, and she maintained that up until the time that she became disabled. Mother canned all summer long and into the fall. We, in addition, we of course picked huckleberries and wild strawberries, blackberries and raspberries, and grapes and cranberries for jelly, that is wild grapes, and some of the wine is also made out of elderberries, which we picked. And of course that was again the winemaking was my dad's hobby. And of course Herman and I, we picked in season, we picked the dandelions, the yellow dandelions, and that became the basis for his wonderful dandelion wine. And wine was also made from the cherry and blackberry. The wines were aged in wooden kegs, usually in 3 to 5 gallon lots. The one I recall most was probably wild grape juice, made from white grape juice that was sent up from Toledo, from the Herzl family. They would send white grape juice up in 5-gallon tin cans, and every season this ship would come in by D&M Railroad, and of course everybody knew that Grambua was going to make wine. That stuff was aged in 10-gallon wooden barrels. In our house, the wine was the beverage used for company, and who came for dinner or for a visit. And I also remember the time between 1920 and 1933 when it was a period of prohibition, and it was also illegal to manufacture or sell alcoholic beverages of any kind, and many people, of course, satisfied their thirst by making home brew beer and other alcoholic delicacies. Well, let's see what we got. We're going to play this back now and see whether I got anything. This is Harry Grambua again, and we're kind of reviewing some of the things that happened during my lifetime here in Rogers City. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about what happened, what did we do for entertainment as kids, not only in elementary school but in high school here in Rogers City. Well, it'll depend upon the season of the year. In the summer, we spent a lot of time swimming at what we call the Heft Docks in Rogers City. Those were commercial docks where the large D&C freighter boats and passenger boats used to come in to distribute freight and take out passengers. The boats were a common form of transportation before we had the railroads. And I made several trips as a very young person down to Detroit, Toledo, and Cleveland, and primarily because of the fact that as a youngster I'd been hit by polio. But we'll talk about that at another time. But we played baseball, and there were a lot of small diamonds around town. The principal one, of course, was right across the street from our home, which is now called Westminster Park. That was the chief park of the community where we played baseball. There were other events held there, circuses and tent shows. And in the wintertime, it became a big ice rink, a beautiful rink. Also, we did a lot of hiking, and at appropriate times of the year, of course, not just our family, but many families, we picked wild raspberries, wild blackberries, wild strawberries, and huckleberries. And those were all available in the area surrounding Rogers City. Many people used them, of course, for not only just for general eating, but for canning. And some of the berries, of course, especially huckleberries, were shipped by boat and later on by train to the downstate markets. We spent a lot of time, I did, at least spent a lot of time fishing, trout fishing in Trout River, Swan River, and or bullhead fishing or pike fishing with my dad at Lake Nettie and Lost Lake, and the other lakes in the area, including Swan Lake and Little Lake, which was on the Calcite property. We didn't, in the fall, of course, we hunted rabbits We hunted partridge, we hunted ducks. We didn't hunt deer right away because the deer did not come back into this area until the period of the 30s. I didn't start hunting deer until about 1935 when I came back here to teach. And I didn't shoot my first deer until about 1938, and then hunted deer for the next 35 years, mostly in the Hawks area on property that was owned by our mother and dad, George and Alma Grambua, on Lost Lake. They had approximately an 80-acre area of land there that was about a quarter of a mile of frontage on Lost Lake. In the summertime around here, of course, we took part in the normal activities. We did have summer recreation programs that did come in. We did have one tent show that came in, was called the Chautauqua, which is still going. It was a tent show that came in with very, very high-class entertainment, usually set up probably in the area around where the City Hall is now in Rogers City, and they provided excellent entertainment in the form of plays, in the form of music, in the form of speakers that came in to talk on certain subjects. Sometimes it was athletics, sometimes it was gymnastics, but it was a very, very high-quality program where they entertained the adults in the evening and kids in the afternoon. We also had another tent show that came into town called the Kelly Shows, and they put on regular dramatic productions for a period of a week or 10 days before they moved on to the next community. They would also set up in that particular area. Then, of course, I all remember we occasionally in my younger days had the circus. The circus was come to town, had been brought in by the D&M Railroad, and they'd march down 3rd Street and set up their big tent headquarters in the area which is now occupied by St. Ignatius Church. There was a large commons in there, and that's where the circus would set up along with the elephants and the caged tigers and lions. And they had a regular 3-ring type circus event with the gymnasts and the other forms of entertainment with the clowns and the whole field as you understand a circus to be. We also recreation for a little later on for older kids, of course, were dancing. That was always been popular and still is popular in this area. There are a good number of dance halls in the area. Now you got to remember in those days that we did not have, this was the period of Prohibition, and so you had no bars or you had no beer gardens. And so the entertainment in form of dancing was in halls. There was an old Germanate Hall, which was in the Pinewood area. They danced at the Oddfellow Hall, which was on Main Street in Rogers City. And then we had a large recreational called Rink, which was located just where the bowling alley is now. And that served as a kind of community center. It was originally built for roller rink skating, and then it served for basketball for the high school and for the adult population until it burned in the early 20s. For a couple of years we had no facility to entertain basketball teams. The teams practiced, but the high school during that period of time, before the new gym was built, which we call now the junior high gym, they played all their games away from home. They did practice after about 1924. For a few years they just practiced at the gym in the new Presbyterian Church, which of course the gym is still there, but it's been converted for other purposes. But there was a small gym there that was used by the Boy Scouts and others, and some of the high school team did practice there, but of course they couldn't hold games there because it wasn't strong enough, and there was no audience area to watch the games. So but there was a lot of, as I say, a lot of dancing. There were dance halls at practically every crossroad in the rural area, in Metz, in Belknap, Hagensville. They had the dance halls, and there was a large dance hall at Lake Nettie, which was very, very popular. Where in the summertime, usually on weekends or sometimes 3 times a week, they would have dances. It was also true at some of the other big lake resorts at Long Lake and Grand Lake, where they had dance halls for the entertainment of the tourists who came up to spend the summers. That was true all over the North Country in the lake areas. Here in this area also, we of course danced to, in the home entertainment was usually dancing, and we danced when the high school started. We danced to the music of the big bands, that is records. Most of the dance halls had live music. However, for home entertainment, we danced to phonograph records, and you danced to the music of the big bands, the phonograph records, or there was sheet music, and of course a lot of kids could play piano, and but the big bands we danced to were the music of, say, like Glenn Miller, Ted Lewis, Ted Weems, Clyde McCoy, Wayne King, Guy Lombardo, Kay Kaiser, Lester Lannon, Duke Ellington, Eddie Duchin, Woody Herman. Those were samples of the records that kids had, which they would use for dancing in the homes. We didn't have a high school band until after we had the new gym. And I remember playing in the first band. I wasn't very good, but neither was the whole band very good. The first band man that we had was a man by the name of Baker. He was the director of the Rogers City Community Band, and he needed recruits. He needed to build up his band, so he agreed without pay to show kids how to play musical instruments. He rounded up 25, 30 of us, or probably more, found instruments here, there, and everywhere that they could use for practice purposes. And we practiced in the high school and played at a few affairs there as just pure entertainment. I don't know how good we were. Jack Sibley, who was the principal of the high school at the time, I asked him how it was. He said, well, he didn't know how good it was, but he said it was loud. But some of those kids went on and became part of the city band for many, many years. And it was always a training ground, and still is to this day. The high school band becomes the training ground for the city band. Rogers City is still one of the few communities of the North that supports a city band for summer entertainment, usually at the Lakeside Park. Also in the summertime, of course, after we got into high school, we had to find jobs. That is, the kids found jobs. Some worked in stores. Some of the kids worked on the farms. And then there was a good number of kids every year, maybe 30, 35 kids from age 16 on up, who worked at Michigan Lime. And Michigan Lime provided summer work for these fellas. We were paid a handsome sum of 25 cents an hour. We worked a regular 8, 9-hour days, sometimes 10. And we did yard work of all types and descriptions at the plant, including the building of the breakwater, and including the extension of the docks. And we cleared away some of the old town of Crawford's Quarry, tore down all the old buildings that were left standing there from years ago. And we did track work, and we did some work around the community. We built the tennis courts, which are still, some of them still visible along Lake Street there, right next to the lake. And we also built tennis courts on the school property between the new high school and the old grade school, and the old high school. And previous to that, the only tennis court in town was this clay court, which is immediately adjacent to the courthouse. That is right now where the new city or county jail stands. That was the tennis court area for the community. Well, now what can we talk about? Well, maybe we could talk a little bit of something about the schooling. My schooling. Well, I started school 1916 in a kindergarten class, and went through the normal 13 years through the grade school and high school. And I remember our kindergarten class that we started in with back in 1916 had 104 kids in it. And it was split up and finally brought down to a number that could be handled in the morning and afternoon session. And our teacher was Mrs. Dedman. I still recall most of the elementary teachers that I had. during those years. This was in the old yellow brick building, yellow wooden building, which was torn down here some years ago. Originally started out as a 4-room building, and then when I started there about 1918, they put on 4 more rooms. These are large rooms, a 2-story building. And when they put on the second edition in 1918, they also put in inside toilets. Before that, the original building that I went to had outside toilets. And then they put in running water and made quite a few improvements. In the intervening periods of time, of course, they had built that served grades 5 through 12. The 7th through 12th grade was housed in one great big room on the second floor, which we called an assembly hall. That took care of all the kids from grades 7 through 12 in that one room. And from that assembly hall, of course, they moved out to the various classes for the classes that they took. But to get back to the elementary, I started out with a teacher named Lillian Dedman, who was out of Alpena, and later, after she retired, she went back there. And then I had a teacher by the name of Margaret Moore in the 1st grade. She married a local man here by the name of Leo Buckets Kuhlman. He, by the way, was the man, along with his brother, who designed the spring air floor, gymnasium floor, which is up in the new high school here in Rogers City at the present time. And if you go up on the plaque in the corridor up there, you'll see his name mentioned as it was his floor that's in that building. Other elementary teachers that I had a teacher by the name of Wilhelmina Cars, another one by the name of Ruth Anderson. I had Feem Sibley in the 3rd grade. Now, Feem Sibley became Mrs. John Sibley, the principal of the high school. And then in the 4th grade, I had a teacher by the name of Doris Giroux. And then in the 5th and 6th grade, primarily I had a teacher by the name of Dora Brady. Dora, a lot of you remember, was a very, very fine teacher. In fact, she taught for me after she came back after raising her family, and she taught for me when I was superintendent of schools. And she was a fine futurist, a real teacher. I would have to say probably one of the top teachers that I ever had in any grade. She was a pure futurist. She just simply believed that the stuff that she was doing, that you were doing in school, was for your own benefit, your own future, so get at it. She had very, very high expectations and very, very high discipline in her classes. Other teachers that I had as I went along in high school, I think I remember most of them, because there weren't so many at that time, because the grades were not very big. My particular class that I graduated in 1930, for example, had 25 in the class. But we had some teachers. There was H.H. Gilman, of course, who was the superintendent, and he taught 8th grade civics as well as senior civics and economics. There was Milton Young, who was the principal for a period of time when I was in high school, and he taught the science, chemistry, and physics. His wife, Lucille, taught English. Another one of the English teachers was Dorothy Baker. And then there was Bertha Klein. There was Gertrude Fiegel in history. And there was Beatrice Comlicoy in typing and shorthand and bookkeeping. And there was Hurdle Feeman, who was the chemistry teacher. And there was John Strandberg, who taught physics. And then later on, another one of the high school teachers that we had was the name of Paul Livingston. And then Josie Schutz became Josie Valentine. She taught the music and art. And Genevieve Raines, who many of you remember, wasn't teaching full-time at that time, but she had taught full-time for many years in the area of history and Latin and history, Latin, and English. My Latin teacher happened to be Bertha Klein, and that was very, very common for kids in those days to take a couple of years of Latin. In fact, at one time in Rogers City High School, they taught the full 4 years of Latin. We had subjects like chemistry and physics and typing. I had 4 years of English, 3.5 years of math, and 3 years of history. History was a little bit different than what we have it now. We had a year of ancient history, then we had a year of modern history, and then a year of U.S. history and civics and economics. And then we didn't broaden our program really until we got into the new high school, where we were able to add such things as the shop mechanical drawing. We did have a little kind of mechanical drawing for kids going back as far as 1926 and 27, after the new Presbyterian church was built. There was some room over there that the high school rented. They put in some desks, and a man by the name of Hugh Lewis, who was from the plant, taught a class for mechanical drawing, because they needed more people down at the plant who were capable of doing drawing, and some of these kids, after they got out from high school, were given jobs down there in their drawing department. And it became very, but it was originally funded by Michigan Lime, funded the introduction of that program. But then, of course, later on, Milt Hoffer came here as the first teacher of mechanical drawing and general shop. And then Paul Thornley came as an instructor in chemistry and physics. Then later on, the plant hired him away from the school to head their chemistry department at Michigan Lime. And then the homemaking department was put in at that time, and the phys ed department was put in at that time. And we had expanded library facilities. The library facilities that we had at the time, that the first 2 years or 3 years that I was in high school, was pretty meager. It consisted of only a couple of hundred books in a room, which they called the library in the old building, but it was not very well stacked. But of course, they didn't have room for books, so there wasn't much need of spending money unless you could possibly catalog it and hire a librarian who understood the library system. After I graduated from high school in 1930, I went to work at the project of going to college. But I would say first, before that, let me say that on regard to summer employment, I mentioned the fact of working at Michigan Lime. I worked down there when I was in the 9th grade, the 10th grade, and in the summertime. In the 11th grade, I worked with a survey crew headed by Mr. Loud, who was the county surveyor, and we ran a line that summer from the Spence Road north of town to the Akiak River along the bluff. Where US 23 runs along the bluff from the Spence Road to the Akiak River, we ran that blaze line through there. And it's interesting to note that the crew that we had there, headed by Mr. Loud, there were some of the fellows around town who worked on that here. They're no longer around, but they did work on it. One of them was Mr. Homer Richards. The Richards family was here in that town at that time. Another one was Reuben Summers. Mr. Reuben Summers was a brother to Mrs. Charlie Vogline. Another one was well-known, a man around town, was John Fertelman. John Fertelman was a man who played drums in the city band. And then Fred Fleming, who was a local hardware man and businessman here for many, many years, was in that crew. I was there, and another young fellow by the name of Paul Ewell. Now, Paul Ewell at that time, the family had lived here as a young person. He lived immediately adjacent to us on 3rd Street. And I knew him well. In fact, even as of today, I still correspond with him. He moved to California and became very prominent in the cinematography field in Hollywood. Well known as a photographer. After graduating from Michigan State, that summer, before I went, I worked for a summer in the bank here in the local bank, and just as a fellow who ran some of the bookkeeping machines and the posting machines. And then I went to Michigan State, started in there. My older brother Herman, was also attending Michigan State at that time. And I started out in the field of applied science, but then switched to liberal arts. While I was at Michigan State for a period of about 3 years, I lived in a fraternity house and enjoyed fraternity life very, very much. I was affiliated with, and still am, with Sigma Alpha Epsilon, which I joined at that time. And I graduated from Michigan State in 1934, and then went out looking for a job. Now, you got to remember that those were the years of the Great Depression. and it was very, very difficult to find a job. I laid around for a year before a job opened, and where did it open? It opened in Rogers City. I had applied for every town north of Bay City, and so did all the rest of the kids who came out of the colleges and university at that time looking for jobs. And if they were in the teaching field, they just went around and applied to every school in the area, giving them their credentials and where they were when they were available. It just so happened that an opening came here. I took it, and it developed into a lifetime job. I started in the fall of 1935, and at that time when I joined the faculty, I had a kind of a unique situation. I was living at home because of the Great Depression, of course, but I had my twin sisters, Ernestine and Therese, as my students in my class, and they were in the 8th grade. I had my sister Grace, and she was in the 10th grade. I had her in world history, and I had my brother George, who was a senior, in study halls. So it was a kind of a ticklish, tight situation. And as I say, I walked very, very carefully at home and stayed out of their way. But it worked out. I spent 9 years as a regular classroom teacher, and then I spent 6 years as the high school principal. And then in 1950, after the death of my predecessor, Mr. Gilpin, I became superintendent and served in that job between 1950 and 1973 until I retired along with Marion. Now, I met Marion. Of course, she came to Rogers City to teach. Marion was originally from Ludington. She was a graduate of Eastern Michigan College at that time. She started her career teaching in Marlette. She taught there for a period of about 6 years before she decided to accept a job up here in Rogers City, and that's, of course, where I met her. And we were married in August of 1943 in Ludington. We came back, and for several years we both taught. Then she gave up teaching for a while, and I asked her to come back some years later when I needed teachers, because we had gone through a reorganization program in the schools where we took in all the surrounding areas, such as Mulkey and Belknap and Metz and parts of Bismarck Township, and all of a sudden I needed a lot of new teachers. And Marion was an excellent grammar teacher in English, and that's why I asked her to come back and help us out. Well, she stayed on then until 1973 when we both retired. Well, I think that's enough for today. We'll see what happens.